No one expected Pearl Bailey to slip away so quietly in a Philadelphia hotel. She'd come for a routine knee operation, returned to rest, and hours later her light went out. The Broadway queen who taught a divided nation to love died without fanfare. How could a woman who taught America to love live such a divided life? But everything we thought we knew was only half the truth. Pearl May Bailey entered the world in 1918 in Newport News, Virginia, a small harbor town smelling of oil and salt, where ship horns cut through the morning air like restless warnings. It was a place where dreams felt too big for the people who held them, a place where hard work didn't promise escape. Her father was a Pentecostal minister, a man who preached unshakable faith, while her mother was gentle, patient, and endlessly tired. They had expected a boy. They had even chosen the name Dick. When the baby arrived a girl, they called her Dickie, a half-joke, half-judgment nickname that clung to her like a shadow. It became her first wound, the feeling that she had to prove her worth simply to exist. At 4 years old, her world shifted. The family moved to Washington, D.C., where her father took charge of a large congregation. The wooden church doors creaked when they opened, letting in sunlight, dust, and the rising hum of voices. Pearl stepped into a world of clapping hands, swaying bodies, and gospel hymns that rose like smoke toward the rafters. Here, in this charged space, she discovered the sound that would shape her life. Music wasn't entertainment. It was breath. It was survival. But church taught her something else, something far more pragmatic. When the choir reached its emotional peak, when voices cracked with devotion, people didn't just pray. They gave. Bills and coins filled the offering baskets. The louder the joy, the fuller the basket. Little Pearl realized a truth far beyond her years: music could move hearts, but it could also open wallets. It was the first time she understood that a voice could be a lifeline. Yet behind the glow of the sanctuary was a crumbling home. Her parents' marriage was falling apart. Arguments erupted in the small rooms behind the church, sometimes moments after the Sunday applause faded. Pearl learned early that holiness didn't always mean harmony. The tension thickened with each passing year until one day her mother reached her breaking point. She packed their belongings, gathered the children, and left Washington behind. The train to Philadelphia rattled through the night. Pearl remembered the worn suitcases, the smell of cold metal, and her mother's trembling hands. They arrived with almost nothing, just a few coins, a few dreams, and a fragile hope that life might be different in a new city. It wasn't. Her mother remarried soon after, but stability didn't follow. The new husband couldn't hold a job. Winter seeped through the cracks of their small apartment, and summer suffocated the rooms with heat. At 15, Pearl left school and stepped into the homes of wealthy white families as a maid. She scrubbed floors, polished wood, and washed clothes in silence. The houses glowed with warm lamps and the scent of cooked meals, but she could only enter through the back door. Each paycheck, hard-earned and small, her mother folded neatly into envelopes for rent. Some nights, Pearl stared at her bruised hands and whispered to herself, "I wasn't born to bow to anyone." Her world changed when her older brother, Willie, returned home. He had left years before to perform as a tap dancer in small theaters. Now he came back with stories of stage lights, of applause, of artists who made a living by touching people's souls. Willie looked at Pearl and told her she had rhythm in her blood. That she had something rare. Something real. For the first time, she believed him. She entered a small talent contest at the Pearl Theater, choosing "Poor Butterfly," a haunting ballad of longing and heartbreak. When she began to sing, the noisy crowd fell silent. Not because they were stunned, but because her voice carried a softness that felt like truth. When she finished, the applause burst like a wave. In that moment, she felt seen, not as Dickie, not as a maid's daughter, not as a girl pushed through back doors, but as Pearl. That night changed her. It showed her that the small wooden church wasn't the only place where sound could save her. The stage, bright and unsteady, could also be a way out. A bridge between the life she had and the life she wanted. She didn't know yet how steep that bridge would be, or how cold the wind could feel at the top. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Music was her only language of survival. Philadelphia was supposed to be a new beginning, but for Pearl Bailey it quickly became another battlefield. After her mother remarried, money grew even tighter. Pearl left school at 15 and stepped into a world of back doors and whispered instructions. Wealthy white families hired her as a maid. She scrubbed floors, washed clothes, and polished furniture that gleamed under sunlight she never had time to enjoy. She cooked meals she couldn't taste. She stood invisible in hallways filled with music from radios she wasn't allowed to touch. Every paycheck disappeared into rent envelopes, neatly tucked away by her mother. Pearl learned to work in silence. To endure in silence. But silence also sharpened her dreams. Her brother Willie returned at the perfect moment, right when Pearl felt buried under routine and resignation. He walked into their cramped apartment with stories of stages, spotlights, and applause. He spoke about theaters where talent mattered more than skin color, where a voice could lift someone out of poverty. He looked at Pearl as if he already knew the truth she hadn't dared admit. She had a gift. And he insisted she use it. Those words lit something inside her. Pearl entered a talent contest at the Pearl Theater, a small venue known more for its peeling paint than for launching stars. She chose Poor Butterfly, a song dripping with longing. When she stepped on stage, her hands trembled. But the moment she began to sing, the crowd fell still. Her voice carried softness, pain, humor, and hope, all intertwined like threads pulled tight. By the time she finished, the silence shattered into applause so loud it startled her. People didn't clap for perfection. They clapped because something in her voice reached them. For the first time, Pearl felt the spotlight not as heat, but as possibility. But the spotlight can be cruel. 2 weeks later, the club went bankrupt. The owner vanished with the performer's pay. Pearl walked into the street with nothing but a song and a bruising lesson. Success could appear and disappear in an instant. She sat on the curb, watching strangers pass, understanding that talent wasn't enough. She would have to fight for every inch. And so she fought. She sang in smoky bars and roadside taverns where drunks yelled louder than the music. She traveled through mining towns coated in coal dust. Performers called it the coal circuit, a string of cheap venues where the audience was exhausted, half-drunk, and quick to throw bottles. The stages were shaky. The microphones screeched. But Pearl kept singing. Not for applause, there was little of that. She sang to stay alive. To keep moving. To push against the darkness of her circumstances. And it was in those places, amid grit and noise, that her voice changed. It gained weight. Edge. Truth. She no longer sang like a girl seeking approval. She sang like a woman who had lived. During those grueling tours, she met a young drummer. He was kind, warm, and seemed to see past the performer she was becoming. They married quickly, out of loneliness more than love. For a moment, Pearl believed she had found refuge. But the tenderness dissolved into jealousy, anger, and violence. Nights blurred together in shouts and slammed doors. One morning, Pearl looked in the mirror at her swollen face and understood a hard truth: sometimes love doesn't save you. Sometimes it only teaches you how to survive being broken. She left him. Bruised, but alive. That decision became a turning point. She realized that no one, not family, not men, not fate, would save her. She would have to save herself. After leaving her husband, Pearl returned to Washington, but the world around her had changed. War erupted. Stages shut down. Performers scattered. Instead of waiting for opportunities, she created one. She joined the USO, performing for American soldiers across the country. She sang under blinding sunlight, under dust, under helicopters roaring overhead. Soldiers cheered. Flowers landed at her feet. But when the shows ended, she slept in cramped storage rooms marked, colored only. She lived in two worlds at once, one that applauded her and another that rejected her. Somewhere in the midst of those tours, she met another soldier. Quiet. Gentle. A man who looked at her like she was more than a voice. They married quickly, hoping love could outlast chaos. But war had already carved wounds into him. Sleepless nights. Silence. Sudden storms of anger. One morning, he left a note: "I'm not the man you married." Their marriage dissolved not from betrayal, but from exhaustion. Brokenness met brokenness. Pearl learned to keep moving. She sang again in bars. She traveled again by train, carrying nothing but a suitcase and a stubborn refusal to quit. Racism followed her everywhere: clubs that rejected her, customers who insulted her, strangers who struck her when she tried to enter the wrong door. One night in New Jersey, after watching Frank Sinatra perform, two men attacked her with no reason other than her skin color. She wiped the blood from her lips, stood up, and walked away without a word. The next morning, she performed as if nothing had happened. Silence was her resistance. But everything changed in 1944, when she boarded a midnight train to New York City. The city glowed like a promise. Neon lights flickered like constellations. She smelled opportunity in the electricity. For the first time, she felt she was stepping not toward survival, but toward destiny. Her voice carried her into Harlem's greatest clubs. Into rooms filled with cigarette haze, clinking glasses, and the low hum of jazz. The audiences were sharp, critical, powerful. And they loved her. She didn't just sing songs. She told stories. She made people laugh, ache, and remember. Then came the night at the Apollo Theater. As the spotlight found her, the crowd rose in thunderous applause before she even opened her mouth. She sang with a fire she had earned through every bruise, every insult, every broken dream. And when she finished, she wasn't a maid's daughter. She wasn't a backdoor girl. She wasn't the child named by mistake. She was an artist. And this time, she wasn't letting go. New York didn't just open a door for Pearl Bailey, it unleashed a flood. After her breakthrough at the Apollo Theater, word spread fast. Talent scouts whispered her name. Club owners asked for her specifically. And one night, sitting in the front row of a smoky Harlem club, a representative from Columbia Records listened to her sing without clapping once. He simply stood up and walked out. The next morning, a contract arrived at her hotel. For Pearl, that paper wasn't ink and promises. It was permission. Permission to dream louder than her circumstances, louder than the whispers that once told her she was too poor, too dark, too ordinary to matter. Records led to radio. Radio led to bigger rooms. And the bigger rooms led her straight to Broadway. In 1946, she made her Broadway debut in St. Louis Woman. The cast was seasoned, polished, trained. Pearl wasn't. She had never studied acting. She had never taken a formal singing lesson. But when she walked on stage, she carried her life with her, every bruise, every hymn, every smoky bar, every moment of defiance. Audiences rose to their feet night after night. Critics wrote that she didn't play a character, she lived inside one. Her rise wasn't a climb. It was ignition. Soon, she was sharing stages with jazz royalty, Cab Calloway, Duke Ellington, Count Basie. She performed in prestigious nightclubs, sang on national radio, and eventually stood beside Frank Sinatra. The same man whose concert once prompted strangers to attack her was now introducing her as the lady who sings truth. Pearl understood irony better than anyone. Sometimes fate had a cruel sense of humor. Her fame grew until even the White House called. She performed for Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and later Reagan. Cameras flashed. Crowds cheered. Her smile grew wider. But her eyes, always her eyes, remained a little too still, a little too empty. A performer's mask, worn not out of vanity but out of necessity. The world applauded, unaware of the silent abyss behind the curtains. That abyss widened backstage. Directors and producers pressured her to conform to the stereotypes Hollywood still demanded. They wanted her to speak in exaggerated dialects, dems, doses, and discs, the caricature of black speech that Pearl had never used. When she refused, the room fell silent. Women weren't supposed to talk back. Black women even less so. The next day, the script was rewritten. But the industry didn't forget her defiance. Whispers followed her everywhere. Too strong. Too blunt. Too difficult. She knew what they meant. She was supposed to be grateful, obedient, small. Instead, she carried herself with a dignity they didn't know how to confront. Still, success kept rising to meet her. The late 1950s and early 1960s made her a household name. She appeared on major variety shows, charmed audiences with her sharp wit, and delivered songs that made people laugh one moment and cry the next. In 1959, she appeared in Porgy and Bess, one of the first major Hollywood films with an all-black cast. Again, she refused to use a degrading dialect. Again, she won. But her greatest triumph came in 1968 with the role that would define her, Dolly Gallagher Levi in Hello, Dolly. The all-black Broadway revival starring Pearl Bailey and Cab Calloway stunned the entire theater world. Critics doubted it at first, believing no cast could rival the Carol Channing original. But the moment Pearl stepped on stage, doubt evaporated. She didn't just sing the part. She transformed it. Made it warm. Made it fierce. Made it hers. The New York Times wrote, "If Pearl Bailey ever runs for governor, this audience will elect her tonight." The following year, she won the Tony Award for Best Actress. She toured the nation with the show, filling theaters from coast to coast. Audiences didn't watch Dolly Levi. They watched Pearl Bailey carry the character like a crown. Television followed. In 1971, the Pearl Bailey Show premiered on ABC. It lasted only one season, but it made history. She became the first black woman to host her own primetime network talk show. Her charisma was effortless. Her humor sharp. Her sincerity disarming. Guests laughed until they cried. With fame came international tours. She traveled across Europe, Africa, even the Soviet Union as part of the State Department's cultural diplomacy programs. She didn't speak politics, but she didn't need to. Her presence, warm, generous, unbreakable, did the work for her. In 1970, President Nixon named her Ambassador of Love. From a coal circuit singer to America's symbol of unity. Yet even as her world expanded, Pearl carried her shadows with her. Behind the perfect timing, behind the effortless charm, behind the signature laugh, lived a woman who had survived more than she ever spoke aloud. The audience saw the glow. Only Pearl felt the burn. For all the applause Pearl received on stage, her private life was lined with bruises no spotlight could soften. Her first marriage began the way many wartime romances did, fast, hopeful, and desperate for shelter. The young drummer who had seemed gentle during long touring nights turned volatile once the excitement faded. Jealousy shadowed everything she did. Arguments cracked through tiny rooms like gunfire. Some nights ended with slammed doors. Others ended with Pearl covering bruises before bed. She left him after 18 months, carrying nothing but her voice and the conviction that survival meant walking away before love destroyed her. But the world didn't pause for her pain. She returned to work as if nothing had happened, stepping onto stage with a smile that felt heavier each night. Still, she believed in love. She believed she could find someone steady. Someone safe. And in 1948, she tried again with John Randolph Pinkett, a man who seemed refined, educated, and calm, everything her first husband was not. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to feel hope. But behind closed doors, Pinkett unraveled. His charm cracked into possessiveness. His eloquence soured into rage. Each time she returned late from a show, he accused her of things she hadn't done. The drinking grew worse. The arguments turned violent. Pearl tried to stay, believing marriage required endurance, not escape. Then came the night in 1952 when everything changed. Pinkett struck her across the head with a heavy gun. The blow split her scalp. Blood ran down her collar and stained her blouse. Her vision blurred. Her breath shook. And in that moment, Pearl understood something with terrifying clarity: if she stayed, she would die. The next morning, she filed for divorce. She took nothing. Not the house. Not the money. Just her life, her dignity, and the one thing no man had ever been able to take, her voice. Weeks later, she returned to the stage. Audiences saw a glowing star, a woman who made them laugh, a singer with impeccable timing. They didn't see the fading bruise hidden under powder, the pulsing scar beneath her wig, or the quiet resolve that lived in her chest. They didn't know that every smile she offered was stitched together from pain. Behind the applause, she stood alone, proof that sometimes strength isn't loud. Sometimes strength wears lipstick over a wound. Fame protected Pearl from nothing. She lived in a country where talent could make you beloved at night, and your skin could make you a target the next morning. Some audiences adored her. Others walked out the moment they saw her. Hotels refused her. Producers questioned her. Even in glamorous rooms, she felt the cold sting of boundaries she didn't choose. One night after a Frank Sinatra concert, 2 white men attacked her in New Jersey, no provocation, no words, just fists fueled by hatred. She didn't scream. She didn't fall apart. She simply stood up, wiped the blood off her mouth, and walked away. The next day, she performed as if nothing had happened. Silence, once again, became her refuge. But she didn't stay silent when it mattered most. On Broadway and in Hollywood, directors asked her to speak in exaggerated, black dialect, caricatures like dems and dos, phrases created to degrade, not portray. They believed audiences wanted stereotypes. They believed she would comply. Pearl refused. "No one talks like that anymore," she said quietly, firmly. The room fell silent. Scripts paused. Producers exchanged looks. She wasn't supposed to challenge them. Especially as a black woman. Especially in an industry that believed it owned her. The next day, the offensive dialect was removed. But the cost followed her. Colleagues whispered. Critics nitpicked. Casting directors labeled her difficult, dangerous, too honest. No matter how many stages she conquered, no matter how loudly audiences cheered, she carried the knowledge that the world still wanted her smaller. There were restaurants she still couldn't enter. Dressing rooms she still wasn't allowed to share. Contracts she lost because she refused to bend. Pearl learned that fame could dim prejudice, but it could never erase it. Not then. Her resilience wasn't loud activism. She didn't march. She didn't make speeches. She simply lived with dignity in rooms that expected her to bow. She smiled with grace when they tried to reduce her. She held her head high when they tried to shame her. Her defiance wasn't in words. It was in her refusal to disappear. And that refusal cost her, but it also crowned her. After years of broken hope, Pearl found love in the most unexpected place, a quiet backstage moment after a New York show. Lou Belson, the drummer for Duke Ellington, asked if he could play with her band. The moment he touched his drumsticks to the skins, Pearl looked up, startled. Something in the rhythm aligned with something in her. It was gentle. Steady. True. Lou was 6 years younger, soft-spoken, respectful. He didn't treat her like a star. He treated her like a woman. And for the first time in her life, Pearl felt seen without performing. Their conversation stretched for hours, about music, exhaustion, faith, yearning. Love grew slowly. Then suddenly. Years later, Lou would say, "I fell in love with her music first, then with the woman who carried it." But America was not ready. When newspapers announced their engagement, headlines exploded. Promoters canceled shows. Audiences protested. Lou's own father begged him in a letter to end the relationship, warning him he didn't want a mixed-race grandchild. Lou folded the letter and never replied. They married quietly. No guests. No fanfare. Just music as witness. And from that moment, their love became an act of rebellion. Hotels refused them. Some restaurants wouldn't seat them. At certain shows, entire sections of the audience walked out as soon as they appeared on stage together. But Pearl kept singing. Lou kept playing. Their presence, side by side, said more than speeches ever could. At home in California, they found peace. A small ranch in Apple Valley. Pearl gardened. Lou practiced drums on the porch. He wasn't behind her, he played with her, matching her breath with rhythm. Their marriage lasted nearly 40 years. A rarity in Hollywood. A miracle in a divided nation. When asked about their secret, Pearl once said, softly, "We didn't try to hold on. We just never let go." But beneath the harmony was another truth: loving Lou required courage. It meant challenging a country that often punished interracial couples. It meant sacrificing opportunities. It meant standing tall when the world demanded they kneel. Their love didn't save her from pain. But it gave her a harbor. And for a woman who had spent her whole life fighting storms, a harbor was everything. Fame can lift a person higher than they ever imagined, but it can also demand a price the body cannot pay. For Pearl Bailey, that price arrived quietly, then suddenly, like a shadow growing longer across the stage. By the mid-1960s, the signs were hard to ignore. Breathing became difficult. Her chest tightened without warning. Her heartbeat faltered during rehearsals. But Pearl, who had survived broken marriages, racial violence, and the relentless grind of show business, believed her body would obey her the same way her audiences always had. She kept performing. She kept smiling. Until 1965. After a show in Manhattan, Pearl collapsed backstage. Her body fell without grace, without drama, just a silent surrender. Panic rippled through the theater. Stagehands rushed to her, calling her name. She could hear them, faintly, as if they were underwater. A few minutes later, she was carried to the hospital, barely conscious. Doctors diagnosed heart failure and warned her that the next collapse might be fatal. They told her to rest for 3 months. Pearl lasted only a few weeks before returning to the stage. Her voice was no longer the same. It was deeper, heavier, as if it carried all the years she had kept going when her heart begged her to stop. She sang slower. She breathed carefully. But she still sang. For Pearl, performing wasn't work. It was life support. During recovery, she began to write. Her memoir, The Raw Pearl, published in 1968, stripped away the glamour and revealed the woman behind the legend. It was candid, sharp, and honest, so honest that critics were stunned. Readers found in her words a Pearl they had never met. A woman who had been wounded, humiliated, bruised, hopeful, brave, and stubborn enough to keep loving the world even when it didn't love her back. But after decades of applause, Pearl began craving something applause could not give: stillness. She and Lou Belson retreated to Apple Valley, California. They bought a small ranch they named Apple Valley Ranch, a quiet world far removed from Broadway marquees and hotel corridors. Here, life slowed. Mornings smelled of coffee and desert wind. Afternoons drifted by in warm silence. Lou practiced drums softly on the porch while Pearl gardened or read by the window. This was not retirement. This was healing. But Pearl didn't disappear from the world. She simply changed the way she moved through it. In the early 1970s, she began touring less and speaking more. She appeared at charity events. She sang not for fame, but for meaning. Her voice, now weathered, carried something audiences had never heard before: wisdom. Then came a decision no one expected. In 1983, after her second major heart attack, Pearl enrolled at Georgetown University. She was 67 years old. Students arriving to class were stunned to see a Broadway icon sitting among them, wearing glasses, taking notes, and raising her hand respectfully before speaking. She refused special treatment. She submitted all her assignments. She asked permission to miss class when her heart hurt. She studied theology, trying to understand the force that had carried her through so much. She wrote papers that professors described as half essay, half prayer. When Georgetown published its dean's list, Pearl Bailey's name appeared among students 1/3 her age. The Washington Post ran the headline: "The star who traded Broadway lights for the light within." But Pearl insisted she wasn't seeking enlightenment. She was seeking peace. "Faith isn't waiting," she told a friend. "Faith is walking." After leaving Georgetown, she devoted herself to charity. She joined First Lady Barbara Bush in a nationwide literacy campaign, encouraging older women to return to education. She visited schools, churches, and community centers, holding children's hands, telling stories, and repeating her credo: "My religion is action. Faith means moving." By the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, her body continued its slow decline. Chest pains became familiar visitors. Her breath grew shorter. She could no longer stand through entire performances. Still, she refused to vanish. She performed at charity concerts, even when she needed to lean on her cane between songs. At home, life shrank to simple rituals. Pearl read scripture in the afternoons. She wrote letters in careful handwriting. She watched old films with Lou, sometimes laughing softly, sometimes wiping away tears. She walked slowly through her garden, pausing often to rest her hand on the back of a chair or the trunk of a tree. There was no bitterness in her. No resentment for the years she had given to the stage. Only a quiet acceptance. A deep exhale after a lifetime of holding her breath. Her world grew smaller. Her days grew gentler. Her voice grew quieter. The spotlight that once chased her now felt like a memory, warm, distant, and fading. And Pearl, who had spent decades standing strong beneath its heat, finally allowed herself to step into the shadows. Not to disappear, but to rest. Philadelphia, August 1990. The hotel room was quiet, washed in the soft yellow of late afternoon. Pearl Bailey had just returned from a routine knee surgery, a simple procedure she had brushed off with a joke. Doctors said everything went perfectly. She sat by the window, watching the city fade into dusk, the light dimming the way stage lights fall after a final bow. Lou Belson sat nearby in an armchair, flipping through a music magazine, glancing up every few minutes to make sure she was comfortable. Nothing about the moment felt final. But a few hours later, after the sun disappeared and the room slipped into shadows, her heart stopped. No cry. No warning. No audience. Just silence. A silence too gentle, too complete, as if life itself had decided to lower its curtain softly, not dramatically. When Lou realized she was no longer breathing, he felt the world collapse in a single instant. "I lost my best friend," he told reporters later, the only sentence he could form before falling silent for months. News of her death spread the next morning, sending a ripple of shock across America. A woman who had survived poverty, racism, war, broken marriages, and endless touring had died from a simple surgery meant to ease her pain. Television stations replayed clips from Hello, Dolly, and old interviews where she laughed with that unmistakable warmth. Broadway theaters dimmed their lights. In Washington, church bells rang at dusk in her honor. In Harlem, musicians gathered in smoky rooms, playing her favorite melodies long after midnight. In Newport News, her hometown, people left flowers at the steps of the old church where she once learned to sing. Everywhere, the same sentiment echoed: Pearl Bailey had not just entertained America, she had softened it. But the tragedy did not end with her. Lou Belson lived 19 more years, but he never remarried. Their home remained untouched, as if waiting for her to walk back through the door. And the sorrow deepened when both their children died within months of each other, Tony in 2004, Dee Dee shortly after. The Belson-Bailey line faded in silence, leaving the world to carry their memory. Yet Pearl's legacy refused to dim. In 2018, on the centennial of her birth, the city of Newport News opened the Pearl Bailey Library, its walls covered in a mural of her smiling, eyes bright, posture proud. At the National Museum of African American History and Culture, her Hello, Dolly gown stands on display, shimmering under museum lights like a frozen spotlight. Visitors stop to stare, not because of the costume's glamour, but because they feel the weight of the woman who wore it. And Pearl lives on in quieter places too. In jazz clubs that still play her recordings. In university textbooks that cite her memoir The Raw Pearl. In animated shows that named fictional schools after her. In every singer who learned that truth, not perfection, makes a voice unforgettable. From the girl named by mistake to the woman America called the ambassador of love, Pearl Bailey crossed decades with a softness so strong it outlasted prejudice, hardship, and time. Even in death, she didn't disappear. She resonated. Her life began in noise, ship horns, church choirs, applause. But it ended in silence. A silence that still echoes. In the end, Pearl Bailey's story is not a tale of fame. It is a testament to endurance, quiet, steady, and deeply human. She lived through poverty, discrimination, heartbreak, and illness, yet somehow carried herself with a gentleness the world could never quite explain. She didn't march on political stages or deliver fiery speeches. She simply lived with dignity. And in doing so, she shifted how people saw one another. Not through force, but through grace. Her life reminds us that strength is not always loud. Sometimes it's found in the way someone keeps singing after heartbreak. Sometimes it's in the calm smile offered to a hostile world. Sometimes it's in the courage to walk away, or the courage to stay. Pearl taught us that kindness can be an act of defiance, and that love, when held quietly, can be revolutionary. As we look back on her journey, we're left with a question that lingers long after the lights fade. Have we ever truly understood the people we admire? Or do we only see the parts illuminated by the spotlight? Pearl Bailey spent her life stepping between light and shadow, one moment dazzling audiences, the next fighting battles no one witnessed. And perhaps that is what makes her legacy so powerful. She never pretended to be more than human. She simply embraced the fullness of what it meant to be alive. If Pearl's story touched something in you, if it stirred a memory, a feeling, or a moment of reflection, share it with us. Leave a comment. Tell us what stayed with you. And if you want to uncover more stories behind the lights, more lives shaped by struggle and softened by grace, don't forget to subscribe. There are many legends left to explore, and many truths still waiting in the shadows.